Imagine Europe in 1914, like a giant family barbecue that nobody wanted to host, but everyone showed up for anyway. All the big empires were run by a handful of royal cousins who barely liked each other, yet kept pretending they were one big happy family. These men ruled continents, commanded huge armies, and were trusted to make smart decisions. Instead, they treated international politics like a schoolyard fight, where you throw a punch because your friend dared you. This is why the world burned for 4 years. You would think leaders who wore fancy uniforms and spoke 5 languages would have the foresight to stop a global disaster. But no, they reacted to a small crisis in the Balkans like someone had insulted their mustaches. What followed was a chain reaction of stupidity so powerful that it dragged millions into a war. Almost nobody understood. It began in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, which belonged to Austria-Hungary, a creaking empire held together with duct tape and stubborn pride. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, visited the city for a goodwill tour. The problem was that Bosnia had a strong Serbian nationalist presence, and many people wanted independence. A group of young conspirators, fueled by nationalism and bad training, decided they would assassinate the Archduke. Their plan was chaotic from the start. One of them threw a bomb. It bounced off the car and exploded under a different vehicle. You would think the Archduke would cancel the trip. Anyone with basic survival instincts would cancel. But he didn't. He kept going, and his driver took a wrong turn that placed him right in front of the last assassin, Gavrilo Princip, who shot both Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie at point-blank range. This moment should have been a regional tragedy, not the start of a world war. But the emperors of Europe weren't exactly known for calm reasoning. Austria-Hungary saw the assassination as an insult to its prestige, almost like a slap in the face delivered on stage. The empire's leaders wanted payback against Serbia, not justice, not diplomacy. Payback. They wanted to punish Serbia so badly that no one would ever dare challenge them again. Serbia expected trouble, but assumed some negotiation would happen. That is the normal thing for states to do. But Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum loaded with impossible demands. The kind of demands you write when you want the answer to be no. Serbia accepted most of it, but rejected the parts that violated its sovereignty. Any reasonable empire might have paused. Austria-Hungary instead acted like a teenager who finally found an excuse to slam the door and storm out of the house. They declared war. This is where the dominoes began to fall. Austria-Hungary had no confidence in its own military strength, so it needed support. Germany, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, stepped in. Wilhelm was a man who collected uniforms the way people collect shoes. He wanted his army respected across Europe, and he promised Austria-Hungary a blank check, meaning Germany would support whatever punitive action Austria took against Serbia. This was one of the biggest political mistakes in history. It's the equivalent of telling your reckless friend, "Sure, do whatever you want, I'll back you up," without asking what they plan to do. Russia, on the other hand, considered itself the protector of all Slavic peoples, including Serbia. The Russian leadership was insecure about its international standing and feared that failing to defend Serbia would make Russia look weak. They began to mobilize their massive army. Mobilization in 1914 wasn't something you could pause like a game. Once the trains started moving, once the troops started gathering, it was almost impossible to stop the process. Germany watched Russia mobilize and panicked. German generals believed that if war came, they had to strike quickly before Russia had time to gather its full strength. They followed the Schlieffen Plan, a military strategy that was less a plan and more a rigid machine. It required Germany to attack France first, defeat it rapidly, then swing east to face Russia. Again, no room for improvisation. The German leadership assumed the war would be fast, easy, and glorious. No one asked, what if this plan actually makes everything worse? To get to France, Germany decided it needed to march through Belgium, a neutral country. Belgium refused. Germany invaded anyway. Britain had guaranteed Belgium its neutrality decades earlier, and couldn't stand by and watch Germany violate it. Britain declared war. Now the entire European continent was tied into one giant knot, pulled tight by treaties, ego, and the arrogant belief that each nation would win by Christmas. The tragedy is that none of these leaders wanted a world war. They wanted short, controlled wars they could boast about. They believed their armies would march proudly, their enemies would crumble, and the victory celebrations would happen in weeks. Instead, their decisions unleashed a global catastrophe that none of them could stop. Every empire thought it had the perfect plan. Every empire underestimated the enemy. Every empire believed the world would admire their strength. In reality, they created a disaster so large it reshaped the entire planet. Picture the summer of 1914 like a slow-motion train crash. Sirens were blaring, lights were flashing, but the men in charge refused to pull the brakes because they thought the crash would only hurt the other guy. Germany thought it could knock out France quickly. France wanted revenge for the humiliating Franco-Prussian War. Russia believed its honor was at stake. Austria-Hungary thought punishing Serbia would restore its fading prestige. Britain wanted to stand against aggression and protect the balance of power. Eventually, even nations that had nothing to do with Sarajevo, like Japan and the Ottoman Empire, got pulled in. The war began because of pride, fear, stubbornness, and the belief that honor was something worth killing millions for. The leaders of 1914, the moment Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the rest of Europe acted like they were all tied together with explosive rope and someone had just lit the fuse. The problem wasn't just alliances. Alliances alone do not make nations behave like sleepwalkers, heading toward a cliff. The real disaster came from the combination of alliances, rigid military timetables, national pride, and leaders married to their own plans to stop the catastrophe even when they saw it forming. They created a system where diplomacy could not function because the armies, once set in motion, acted like unstoppable machines, and the men in charge refused to slow them down because they believed that looking weak was worse than destroying the continent. Germany's commitment to Austria-Hungary was the first block on the chain. The Kaiser had already offered a blank check, the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Whatever chaos you start, we'll handle it." Austria-Hungary took that deal and rushed into war with Serbia. Confident Germany would back them up, even if the situation spiraled. Germany assumed Russia would be slow to act, and even if Russia did mobilize, the German military staff believed they could handle it. Their confidence came from war plans built over decades, but these plans were rigid, mechanical, and treated war like a math problem, with only one correct answer. Russia, however, saw Serbia as a younger brother. The Russian elite had deep political and cultural ties to the Balkans. Any attack on a Slavic state was seen as an attack on Russia's own reputation. If Russia allowed Austria-Hungary to crush Serbia, it feared losing influence in southeastern Europe. Tsar Nicholas II was not a strong leader, but he had a strong sense of obligation toward this region. He also faced pressure from his generals, who insisted that Russia could not look powerless after a string of humiliations, including defeat by Japan in 1905. The Tsar tried to start a partial mobilization, limited to Austria-Hungary. His generals told him that was impossible. Their plans didn't allow partial. Their entire mobilization system was an all-or-nothing process. So Russia mobilized fully. This single decision created panic in Berlin. Germany looked at Russia's mobilization and interpreted it as a declaration of intent. Germany's generals had convinced the Kaiser that Russia would become stronger with each passing month. They saw mobilization as an immediate threat. Their war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was so rigid that even the slightest hint of conflict forced them into action. Germany could not mobilize only against Russia. Their plan required attacking France first. They believed that once Russia mobilized, Germany had no choice but to start the clock on their own invasion. If they waited, they feared Russia would crush Austria-Hungary, isolate Germany, and ruin their ambitions. So the German High Command pressured the Kaiser into signing the order for general mobilization. Nothing showed how broken Europe's political system was, quite like the way generals and timetables controlled everything. Diplomats were still trying to negotiate. Messages were flying across capitals urging restraint. But the men in charge of the railroads, troop movements, artillery placements, and supply lines insisted that any pause would bring disaster. The military machine had become more powerful than the men who supposedly led it. Once Germany mobilized, France had to join the conflict. France was Russia's ally, and their military leadership believed that matching enemy mobilization was essential. They didn't want Germany striking first, and feared that waiting meant certain defeat. So France mobilized as well. They didn't even need Germany to declare war first. Mobilization itself acted like a silent declaration. Britain watched the crisis unfold with growing alarm. They had a loose alliance with France, and a strong political agreement to maintain the balance of power in Europe. Germany marching through Belgium would break that balance. Britain tried to warn Germany. Germany ignored the warning. Again, not because the German government wanted a war with Britain, but because the Schlieffen Plan did not allow a peaceful alternative. They had to move through Belgium. There was no backup route. It was the most destructive, no Plan B situation in modern history. Belgium refused to let Germany march through its territory. That refusal shocked German leaders. They had assumed Belgium would allow passage, or at least not resist. But Belgium had no interest in becoming a doormat for a massive invasion. They upheld their neutrality, even when it meant facing one of the most powerful armies in the world. Germany invaded anyway, and this action forced Britain into the war. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality decades earlier, and could not ignore the violation. To do so would destroy its credibility. So Britain declared war on Germany. What makes the entire sequence so absurd is that every nation claimed it was acting in self-defense. Austria-Hungary said it needed to defend itself from Serbian nationalism. Russia said it needed to defend Serbia. Germany said it needed to defend Austria-Hungary. France said it needed to defend Russia. Britain said it needed to defend Belgium and the balance of power. All of them claimed to be reacting. None of them admitted they were propelling the continent into catastrophe because they were too stubborn to pause their mobilization schedules. Diplomacy during these days was like watching people shout instructions at a runaway train. Everyone wanted peace, but they wanted peace after they had mobilized. They wanted peace from a position of strength. They wanted peace after they had intimidated their enemies. But the moment they mobilized, they made peace impossible. Mobilization became the point of no return. Not because war was inevitable, but because the planning systems treated mobilization as the start of war, armies were not organized to stay idle. Supplies were expensive, rail lines were needed, and soldiers could not stand waiting for weeks in fields. Everything had to move. Everything had to follow the schedule. People like to imagine that war begins with a declaration or a shot. In 1914, war began with train timetables. This chain reaction demonstrated how completely Europe's leaders had lost control over their own militaries. The generals believed their plans were perfect. When the shooting started in 1914, nobody on any side understood that they had walked into a new kind of war. They thought they were stepping into another round of old European duels fought with polished boots, bright uniforms, and short, glorious charges across open fields. They thought this would be a war where the cavalry would still matter, where a bold officer waving a sword could still inspire men to victory, where courage and willpower could break enemy lines. They had no idea that the world had already changed, and that the battlefield they were preparing for had died decades earlier. They stepped into the first fully industrial war with the mindset of men who still believed in the romance of battle. That mismatch did not just cost lives, it destroyed an entire generation. The birth of mechanized slaughter began the moment the armies collided on the Western Front, and neither side could break the other. The German plan failed when France did not collapse in 6 weeks. The French plan failed when their bright red trousers made them perfect targets. The British Expeditionary Force, trained like a professional rifle club, fought well, but was too small to decide anything. Both sides dug trenches because they needed protection from weapons no previous war had seen on this scale. These trenches were meant to be temporary. Instead, they grew deeper, longer, and darker as each side realized that leaving them meant death. The machine gun was the first sign that the old rules no longer applied. A well-positioned machine gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. A single team could kill an entire company of charging soldiers in the time it took to shout an order. Yet the generals refused to accept what this meant. They still believed that grit and discipline could beat firepower. They sent men over the top in neat rows because that was how armies had always done it. They believed that mass and momentum would overwhelm the enemy. Instead, the machine gun reduced those formations to piles of bodies before they reached the first strand of barbed wire. Barbed wire played a bigger role in the slaughter than most people realize. It turned the battlefield into a cage. Soldiers could not climb over it fast enough to escape enemy fire. They got caught, twisted, and stuck, while bullets ripped through their ranks. When artillery shells landed near the wire, the explosion buried the wire deeper into the mud, creating even more obstacles. An entire offensive could fail because troops could not get through a few tangled rows of steel. Commanders kept ordering advances, thinking the wire would be cut by artillery fire. It rarely was. Instead, it became a perfect trap that slowed men long enough for machine guns to finish the job. Artillery created the rest of the horror. This was not the old, slow artillery of the 1800s. This was rapid-fire, long-range, industrial artillery capable of shaking the earth for miles. A single barrage could kill thousands before the infantry even moved. Soldiers described the constant noise as living under a sky that had forgotten how to stop exploding. Artillery fire shredded bodies, buried men alive, and filled the trenches with shock and terror. Sometimes the only sign a soldier had died was a blood stain in the mud where he had stood moments earlier. These shells also destroyed the landscape so completely that the ground became unrecognizable. Trees vanished, villages became dust. Fields turned into oceans of craters filled with water, bodies, and tangled debris. The trenches were supposed to offer protection, but they became graves waiting to close. Soldiers lived with rats, lice, hunger, and disease. When rain fell, trenches turned into mud pits that swallowed boots, rifles, and sometimes entire men. Some craters were so deep and filled with water that wounded soldiers drowned where they fell. Every movement was slow and exhausting. Soldiers learned to crawl instead of walk because standing made them easy targets. They learned to sleep in shifts because night raids, shelling, and gas attacks gave them no rest. Gas became the most feared weapon because it changed the rules of survival. You could avoid bullets by taking cover. Gas filled the air with death you could not see or outrun. Chlorine and mustard gas burned eyes, lungs, and skin. Soldiers woke up blind. Their lungs filled with liquid, their skin blistered and peeled. Even survivors carried the effects forever. Gas did not always kill quickly. Sometimes it left men alive but doomed, coughing up pieces of their lungs for days. Yet gas attacks rarely decided anything. They only added another layer of torment to the battlefield. The cavalry, once the pride of every army, became useless overnight. Horses could not charge through trenches or barbed wire. They could not outrun machine guns. Cavalry units tried to fight, but they were shredded by bullets before they reached the enemy. Eventually, armies used horses only for transport, not for battle. The romantic image of knights on horseback died in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. Generals clung to outdated tactics because their training told them that wars were won through morale, heroism, and relentless pressure. They ordered grand offensives because their manuals said that constant attacks would break the enemy. They refused to believe that the enemy could absorb such losses and remain strong. They also refused to accept that technology had outpaced their ideas. Instead of changing their approach, they blamed their soldiers. They said the troops lacked spirit, lacked training, or lacked discipline. They kept pushing them across open fields because they did not understand the new reality. The result was a static front that barely moved for years. Millions died for small patches of ruined land. Entire battalions disappeared in minutes. One example told the whole story. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, British soldiers walked toward German lines as if they were on parade. Their officers believed the artillery barrage had destroyed enemy defenses. It had not. German machine gunners waited in protected bunkers. When the British troops approached, the Germans opened fire. By the end of the day, almost 60,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded, and the army had gained almost nothing. Scenes like this repeated across the Western Front. Commanders sent waves of men into death because they believed that overwhelming numbers would eventually break the stalemate. They thought that courage could defeat technology. They never learned the lesson that modern war punished the brave and rewarded the entrenched. The trenches turned the front into a fortress. Neither side could breach without massive casualties. The more they attacked, the more both armies became trapped in a cycle of destruction. Even when tanks entered the battlefield, they were slow, unreliable, and often broke down. Early tanks crawled across the field like metal snails. They scared the enemy at first, but they stalled, overheated, or got stuck. The collapse of four empires in 1918 wasn't some slow, gentle decline. It was more like watching for giant, centuries-old buildings fall down at the same time, because everyone inside kept insisting that the cracks in the walls were part of the design. World War I didn't just end lives. It dissolved entire ruling families who had dominated Europe for generations. It broke political systems that once looked untouchable. And the strangest part is how fast it happened. In 1914, these empires marched to war with confidence. Their leaders believed they were backed by divine right, long tradition, and loyal subjects who would fight and die for them without question. By 1918, all four thrones were gone, and the world they tried to preserve was finished. The first empire to break under the pressure was Russia. The Romanovs had ruled for more than 300 years, which is impressive until you remember how badly they handled every major crisis thrown their way. When Nicholas II dragged Russia into World War I, the country was already struggling. The economy was weak, the peasants were poor, the army was large but poorly supplied, and Nicholas was the kind of leader who thought the best way to solve a fire was to throw more dry wood onto it. He took direct control of the army, even though he had no military skill. He left the government in the hands of people who were better at scheming than governing. And while millions of Russian soldiers died in the trenches, the royal family appeared totally disconnected from reality. Imagine running a country where your people can't afford bread, your soldiers lack boots, and your parliament begs you to step back. Now imagine ignoring all of that because you believe God personally picked you to rule. That was the Romanov mindset. The war magnified every weakness they had. Every military defeat chipped away at their authority. Every factory shutdown drained support from the cities. By 1917, the problems grew so big that even the police who were supposed to defend the regime started joining protests. It reached a point where Nicholas tried to return to the capital, but found the railway lines blocked. Not by foreign soldiers, but by his own people. When a monarchy collapses because train conductors refuse to move the engine, you know the system is done. Nicholas abdicated, hoping his brother would take the throne, but even he refused, sensing the Romanov name was now poison. What followed was chaos, revolution, and the rise of the Bolsheviks, who saw the old order as something to wipe away rather than fix. Russia didn't just lose a dynasty, it lost the entire political system that had shaped its identity for 3 centuries. All because the war exposed a truth the monarchy had hidden for too long. It was old, slow, and too rigid to survive the modern world. The German Empire collapsed next, and it fell for many of the same reasons: exhaustion, starvation, and a royal family that believed it could win a global war through sheer confidence. Kaiser Wilhelm II styled himself as a warrior king. He loved uniforms, horses, medals, and speeches about German greatness. But he was less interested in listening to his generals or governing like an adult. When the war began, he expected a fast victory. Everyone did. But when the conflict turned into a grinding, endless nightmare, the Kaiser didn't know what to do. Germany seemed strong at first. Its industry was efficient, its military was experienced, and its population was loyal. But total war eats even the strongest empires from the inside. The British blockade strangled Germany's access to food and supplies. Factories struggled to replace what was lost at the front. Civilians ate turnips instead of bread. People froze during the winter. And all the while, the government kept promising victory soon, as if saying it enough times would make it real. By 1918, German soldiers were starving, exhausted, and unwilling to keep fighting. The spring offensive failed. The Allies pushed back. The home front began to crumble. Mutinies broke out in the Navy. Workers went on strike. When the people refused to fight, the generals turned on the Kaiser and told him he had become a liability. That was the end. Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands, leaving his empire without a ruler and without a future. Austria-Hungary fell apart even more dramatically. It wasn't so much an empire as a patchwork quilt held together with wishes and fear. Dozens of ethnic groups lived under one crown, and many of them didn't even like each other, let alone the Habsburgs. Before the war, the empire was already fragile. Every major decision took forever because the government had to appease to many competing interests. When the war started, the empire treated it as a chance to show it was still strong. Instead, the conflict exposed how weak it truly was. Its armies were under-equipped, its generals were outdated, and its political leadership couldn't agree on anything except blaming each other for failure. As the war dragged on, national groups inside the empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, saw their chance to break away. Every defeat at the front translated into a push for independence at home. The empire didn't just collapse, it dissolved like wet paper. By the time the war ended, Austria-Hungary no longer existed. The Habsburg monarchy vanished, and a map full of new countries replaced a state that had stood for centuries. The Ottoman Empire was the last to fall, though it had been declining for a long time. People had called it the sick man of Europe for decades, and the war pushed it to the breaking point. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers, hoping a major victory would allow them to modernize and regain influence. Instead, they suffered military disasters, economic collapse, and internal strife. The empire fought on multiple. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was supposed to fix the world. It was supposed to repair the damage, punish the guilty, and keep another global war from ever happening again. Instead, it did the opposite. It became one of the greatest political failures in modern history. The people who wrote it believed they were building long-term peace. What they actually built was a pressure cooker with the timer set for 20 years. When it finally blew up in 1939, the explosion was so massive and so destructive that it made the First World War look like a warm-up. Versailles didn't prevent the next war, it guaranteed it. To understand how badly the treaty failed, you first have to picture the mindset inside the Palace of Versailles in early 1919. Europe was exhausted, bankrupt, and traumatized. 10 million soldiers were dead, millions more were wounded. Entire regions looked like the moon craters, mud and ruins stretching for miles. The leaders of the victorious Allies Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George walked into the conference with the weight of all that destruction on their shoulders. They felt enormous pressure from their populations. People wanted revenge. They wanted justice. They wanted someone to blame for the unimaginable suffering of the past 4 years. And Germany, defeated and isolated, was the easiest target. So the peace conference became less about rebuilding the world and more about making Germany hurt. The logic was simple and short-sighted. If the Germans were the ones who started the war, then they should pay for all of it. If their armies had marched through Belgium and France, then their nation should repair every brick, bridge, and farm they destroyed. If the Kaiser had dreamt of conquest, then the German people should face the consequences. It sounds neat and tidy until you realize that punishing an entire country docently erased the past, it only poisons the future. One of the most dangerous parts of the treaty was the War Guilt Clause Article 231. In plain terms, it said Germany accepted full responsibility for causing the war. This wasn't true, and everyone in the room knew it. The war had started because of failures from every major power. But the clause wasn't meant to be accurate. It was meant to justify the next part, the reparations. The Allies needed Germany to accept blame, so they had legal grounds to send it the bill for everything. And the bill they wrote was enormous. So enormous that Germany couldn't possibly pay it. Imagine losing a war, losing millions of men, losing territory, suffering a naval blockade, watching your empire collapse. And then being told you now owe the victors billions upon billions in gold, resources, and industrial output. The German economy was already shredded by wartime spending, and the treaty demanded payments that made recovery almost impossible. When a country has no way to meet impossible demands, it doesn't magically become responsible. It becomes desperate. And the desperation came fast. Germany printed money to pay its debts. The printing presses ran around the clock. What followed was one of the worst periods of hyperinflation in history. The German mark collapsed so completely that a loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. People carried their wages home in baskets because wallets weren't big enough to hold the notes. Children used stacks of currency as building blocks because it was cheaper than buying toys. This wasn't just economic pain. It was humiliation in daily life. Everyone felt it. Every family, every worker, every shopkeeper. And resentment hardened into something dangerous. Many Allied leaders didn't understand how quickly humiliation turns into extremism. When you take a proud nation, crush its economy, take its land, shrink its military, and force it to sign a document saying it alone caused the worst war in history. You don't create peace, you create anger. You create a population that feels betrayed and wounded. You create political chaos where extremists can thrive. Versailles didn't just punish Germany, it destabilized it. The treaty also carved up Germany in ways that made the situation worse. Territories with German-speaking populations were handed to new states like Poland and Czechoslovakia. The industrial Saar region was placed under League of Nations control. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The German Navy was stripped down to almost nothing. The army was reduced to 100,000 men, barely enough to police the country, let alone defend it. Many Germans saw these terms as attacks on their national dignity. And in a sense, they were. The treaty's authors believed weakening Germany would keep Europe safe. Instead, it created the perfect conditions for radical politics. This environment was the one that allowed extremist groups to rise. When people lose faith in democratic leaders, they start listening to anyone who promises strength, revenge, and restored pride. Germany in the early 1920s was full of such voices. One of them was a failed Austrian painter who had served in the war and believed the treaty was a crime. He called the treaty a shameful diktat. He argued that Germany had been stabbed in the back, not by foreign armies, but by weak politicians and internal traitors. His name was Adolf Hitler. Versailles didn't create him, but it gave him the oxygen he needed. Even outside Germany, the treaty weakened the foundations of peace. It created new states across Eastern Europe, but many of these borders were drawn quickly, carelessly, or with political bias. National groups were split apart. Others were forced together. These fragile new countries needed stability and cooperation, but the treaty didn't give them tools to succeed. Instead, Europe became a maze of grievances. Everyone wanted something different. Nobody trusted anyone else. The Allies also made a crucial mistake by refusing to enforce the treaty consistently. When Germany fell behind on its payments, France occupied the Ruhr Valley in 1923. This only